Welcome, everybody. We are here for another talk, this one by Joaquin Rivaya Martinez, who is Associate Professor of History at Texas State University, talking about captivity narrative. And so we're just going to see if in a moment he is able to join us here virtually. Hopefully he won't get lost like what happened to Cowboy Mike at our first presentation. But Cowboy Mike made it. He came back and he joined in. So he didn't get lost out in the trail anywhere. So let me just go ahead and introduce him. And if he comes in, we will all then be able to wave and say hello. Joaquin Rivaya Martinez, as I said, is an associate professor of history at Texas State University. He holds a PhD in anthropology from UCLA and is a fellow of SMU's Clements Center for Southwest Studies. He specializes in the indigenous history of the U.S.-Mexico borderlands and the southern Great Plains during the 18th and 19th centuries. Rivaya Martinez's scholarship involves extensive archival research in 4 countries, interviews with contemporary consultants, and the use of ethnographic, archaeological, linguistic, and environmental evidence. He conducts his research in close contact with members of the Comanche Nation and currently writing a book on Comanche captives. And Dr. Rivaya Martinez is originally from Asturias, Spain, before he came to the U.S. and studied in his got his doctoral degree in anthropology. And he has written some really wonderful articles talking also about depopulation, talking about effects of disease. And so, of course, teaching Texas history, I need to be aware of his work for both my research and because it is cutting-edge research that he's doing. And so we'll see here if he can join us in just a sec. He's there? Okay, great. Hola, Joaquin. ¿Me puedes oír? Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes, all right. We can. Sounds
all
good.
Right.
I just did the introduction of you from the program. Okay, Joaquin?
Yeah, I heard you. Thank you for
wonderful.
your kind words.
Okay,
yeah.
Great.
I just was wondering if you guys can hear me and can you also see my PowerPoint?
If you can make it full screen, that might help even more.
If I can make it full screen, yeah. I was going to do that, but you can already see it, right?
Okay. And then when there's 10 minutes left, Joaquin, I will come up for Q&A.
All right. So let me get back to the beginning.
Okay.
We'll be on in a second.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Awesome. So it is my honor that I got to introduce also my friend, Joaquin.
All right. Well, thank you very much for those kind words, Francis. And I would like to also thank Mary Margaret and everyone at the Witte for this kind invitation to be a part of this event. And also John Gomez and Enrique for helping out with the media to make this remote presentation possible. So anyway, I've been a little bit under the weather the last couple of days, and I'm going to read my presentation, if that's all right. So of all the Western tribes, Apaches and Comanches, who call themselves Numenu, meaning our people or the people, arguably put up the longest and costliest resistance to white settlement since Spanish colonial times, as a matter of fact. And surprisingly, both Comanches and Apaches have become one of the most enduring icons of the Wild West and Old Texas. The Lone Star was an independent republic for roughly 10 years, during which Indians and Mexicans quickly became the antagonistic others against whom a dominant Anglo-Texan identity was established, partly by forging frontier myths, heroes, and anti-heroes that have resisted surprisingly well the test of time. During those early years, Comanches clashed with the encroaching Anglo-Americans in a series of encounters that were widely publicized and exaggerated, thus entering Texan lore as aggressive and warlike opponents. And I'm going to be showing you some images all along, but unfortunately, none of these images date from the time period that I'm going to be talking about. So most of the pictures that you'll see date from the late 1860s, early 1870s, and I'm going to be talking specifically about the late 40s, early 50s. For instance, the legendary raid on Fort Parker on the headwaters of the Navasota River in today's Limestone County on May 19, 1836, resulted in the killing of several settlers and the kidnapping of 2 women, 2 boys, and a girl, Cynthia Parker. Oops, let me show you here. Let me do something with the pointer here so that we can use it properly. Okay, so this lady here is Cynthia Parker, who was kidnapped as a small child at the Fort Parker raid. She would eventually become the mother of famous Comanche leader, Quanah. So this fabled incident at Fort Parker, often blamed exclusively on Comanches, has become one of the foundational myths of the Texas Republic. The attack was actually a multi-ethnic endeavor involving Comanches, Quetzals, and members of other indigenous tribes. And it was likely triggered by the usurpation of native claimed land, by the fort dwellers, and by the use of the settlement as a launching pad for militia campaigns against the Indians. So this incident, for instance, didn't come out of the blue. There was a specific, very particular circumstances that triggered it. Contrary to conventional wisdom, however, it was not Anglo-Americans, but Hispanics who bore the brunt of Comanche raiding. The area south of the Nueces River became an important Comanche hinterland as early as the 1810s, when the development of the cotton industry created an unprecedented demand for horses and mules in the US South. In fact, the ebb and flow of Comanche raiding depended heavily on Anglo-American market demands, and the Comanche trade in Mexican plunder benefited many in Texas and beyond. Even though the main goal of Comanche raiders generally was to obtain livestock, if the opportunity presented itself, they also took captives and other plunder from enemy groups. They used to abduct children and young adult women for a variety of reasons, but most commonly for their labor. Comanche captives belonged to their captors, who sometimes gave them away to a relative or sold them to non-kin. The receivers were usually childless couples, elderly or widowed relatives, or individuals in need of a caregiver. Comanches captured scores of people of diverse ethnic and geographic origins on both sides of the Rio Grande for much of the 19th century. Even though most Comanche captives were Hispanic, scholarly discussions tend to rely on captivity narratives written by, on, and for Anglo-Americans. Some narratives of Comanche captivity are entirely apocryphal, like this one here. Oh, sorry, like the one on Miss Carolyn Harris. Others are based on actual facts, like Mrs. Horns. In other cases, these narratives contain so many spurious passages that it is hard to tell what is true from what is not. Most captivity stories are literary works written to generate revenue for their authors and publishers. To guarantee their sales, they typically reproduce plot lines and stylistic conventions peculiar to the genre, irrespective of the facts. So these stories circulated widely along the frontier since the 18th century, as a matter of fact, since the 17th century. But in most cases, they were either total or partially apocryphal. In 1847, Comanche Raiders captured a 13-year-old Hispanic boy called Macario Leal in the outskirts of Laredo, Texas. Macario lived in captivity until the spring of 1854, when he fled the Comanches during another raid, turning himself in at the Hacienda del Gallo in the Mexican state of Durango. He was shortly sent via Durango City to Monterrey, Nuevo León, where military authorities interrogated him about his life among the Numina. That's the name the Comanches used for themselves. I published an article in the Southwestern Historical Quarterly, which is actually an annotated translation of Macario's deposition a few years ago. And the interesting thing about Macario's testimony is that, contrary to the captivity narratives by Anglos that I mentioned before, it offers the unique perspective of a Hispanic Texan who became a direct witness of the Comanche nomadic lifestyle, and it contains a wealth of information on Comanche culture and the geopolitical situation of the border between Mexico and the US in the mid-19th century. We know little about Macario's family and early life. His father, Jose Maria Leal Camarillo, was born in Burgos, Tamaulipas, and married Maria de los Reyes Delgado de los Santos in Laredo on April 19, 1928. Their son, Macario Leal Delgado, the one that I'm talking about, was born around 1833. Macario apparently had a brother who was killed at the time of his capture. Most Hispanic children in mid-19th century Laredo, and I would say in much of Texas and more broadly the United States, at the time were illiterate and spent much of their time helping their relatives farm and tend the livestock, as Macario was doing when Comanches kidnapped him. Macario, however, identified himself as a shoemaker in his deposition. He likely had some formal education, judging from the elaborate autograph with which he undersigned his deposition, which you can see here. So this is a picture of another captive ransomed from the Comanches around 1870. But I thought it would be an interesting one to show, just to give you a sense of what a Mexican captive among the Comanches may have looked like. This is an image from the original deposition, which is now available at the Archivo Municipal de Monterrey. That's the local archives at Monterrey City. Macario's captivity presents numerous similarities with the experiences of other captives, particularly other non-infant boys, including Anglos such as Theodore Babb, whom you have here on the left, and Clinton Smith here, which suggests that the destiny of captives depended more on sex and age than race or ethnicity. Comanche raiders often attacked isolated individuals in the countryside, typically killing the adult men, but often kidnapping children and young adult women. Even though Comanches preferred younger captives whom they could acculturate and incorporate more easily, they sometimes abducted enemy males in their early teens, particularly if the raiders discovered them tending livestock. Captors customarily used such captives as horse herders, as was the case with Macario. So, for Macario Leal, as for most Comanche abductees, early captivity was an ordeal, especially when Comanches traveled across enemy land. In this case, Macario was kidnapped in Laredo, and he was taken north to the Colorado River via San Antonio. This map that I will keep showing you in the next few slides represents the areas mentioned in Macario's deposition. Okay. When Macario first saw his captors, he froze out of fear. One of the Comanches made him mount on the ramp of his horse, while the others chased two of the boy's relatives, killing and scalping Macario's brother in front of him. The raiders then made the captive strip the still warm corpse. Comanches often tied their non-infant captives tightly to their mounts, which the captors habitually drove ahead of them. Thus, captives had little or no control over their mounts while on the move, which left them exposed to thorny vegetation, harmful insects, and inclement weather. Macario found himself shortly on a bitless horse, his feet tied under the mount's belly, his waist bound to the head of the saddle, and his hands tied together on his back. With Macario riding in such an uncomfortable position, the warriors whipped his horse to drive it. The numerous mesquite trees along their march damaged the captive severely and made his upper body bend backwards without his lower body being able to follow that motion, causing him tremendous pain. Comanches sometimes beat their captives for failing to obey orders or for not behaving as they expected. During Macario's first night in captivity, the Comanche's horse herd stampeded, spooked by some noise. His mount followed the others in their flight, and the boy spent that night lost. The following morning, when the warriors found Macario, they scolded and whipped him for not having stopped the horses. despite the captive's desperate attempts to apologize, arguing that he was tied. Comanches customarily beat recently kidnapped non-infant captives upon their first arrival in camp. The abuse inflicted could be severe, but Comanches normally avoided killing, mutilating, or otherwise physically impairing their prisoners. As soon as Macario's captors reached their camp in the afternoon of the second day, some Comanches took Macario down from his horse and dressed him and beat him so badly that he thought he would die. Comanche females could be particularly cruel with both male and female captives during their first days in camp. An elderly woman named Tabepete, from Comanche Tabe son and perhaps Pete daughter, so this may mean something like daughter of the sun, tormented Macario the most that dreadful day. Tabepete's Spanish name was Arriba del Sol, which means literally above the sun or on top of the sun. According to Natividad Luján, a native of San Carlos was a small town in northern Chihuahua, which is now called Manuel Benavides. So according to this native of San Carlos who saw Tabepete many times there when he was a boy, she used to give commands to the Comanche warriors from the belfry of the church in front of the placita. She was the mother of a famous Comanche leader named Bajo el Sol that apparently was the one who captured Macario, as we will see. Tabepete was probably the same old woman who, according to another source, commanded the southern Comanches who inhabited the Bolsón de Mapimí, which is a huge desertic region across the states of Chihuahua and Coahuila, and also the northern part, the northeastern part of Durango. So Tabepete was apparently the leader of this bunch of Comanches around the year 1850. Indeed, Mexican sources refer to her as a prophetess, a female general, which placed her above Comanche leaders, whom were typically referred to as captains or small captains. And all of this suggests that Tabepete played an influential role in the raids, likely as a pujakatu, which in Comanche means a possessor of supernatural power, someone who could perform what we would call miracles. And she probably had the ability to foretell the future. Tabepete was reportedly killed by Mexicans at the watering place of the Espiritu Santo Canyon in Chihuahua on February 13, 1854. Her memory, however, was still alive in Comanche oral tradition as late as the 1970s, when folklorists Alice Marriott and Carol Racklin collected the story that, and I'm quoting, there was a Comanche West Point somewhere in the Sierra Madres, in the state of Chihuahua, Mexico, where young warriors were sent for training. And according to their sources, also, and I quote again, the commandant of this military installation was a woman. So as you can see, this correlates very well with Macario's testimony. Going back to Macario's story, and actually this is the place where Tabepete was killed, apparently the Sierra del Espíritu Santo here. I have to say that this region nearby, the Laguna de la Jaco, was a preferred Comanche campsite down in Mexico. Anyway, so going back to Macario's story, the following day, the whole group of about 40 Comanches, including men and women, headed for San Antonio de Béjar. On the way, they came across some American smugglers and killed them all, destroying their freight of cloth and tobacco, and taking away their mules and draft horses. Upon reaching the San Antonio area, the Comanches killed some cattle and gave Macario some meat with cold marrow, warning him that he must eat to burst him. When he could ingest no more, they forced him to drink a full gourd of water. Next, they made him a thick cigar of American tobacco and forced him to smoke it so that he threw up everything. While he was doing it, they tied a rope around his waist and threw him into a stream where he sank, swallowing much water. When he was about to drown, they took him out and squeezed his belly, again making him vomit all the water. Later that day, after passing San Antonio, Comanches untied Macario for the first time. That night, they stopped in the bush, far away from the settlement, to kill a horse that they roasted to eat. They gave Macario the horse's raw kidneys, which the captive initially refused to munch, but the Comanches lashed him into tasting it. After that, they denied him water for 3 days. Every night before going to sleep, Comanches tied Macario's hands behind him and bound his feet with a rope that they threw over a tree to raise the lower half of his body, leaving him uncomfortably resting on his back. Mistreating Macario in this way, the Comanches continued um, to move till they reached their main encampment about a month and a half later. The people there received the captive with another whipping, which he took as a sign of joy for the arrival of the bunch. That night, they pranced around a big bonfire, forcing him to dance in front of his brother's scalp. Comanches customarily held scalp dances of this kind to honor the return of victorious warriors, bringing enemy scalps. Newly brought captives were often compelled to participate in those dances, holding the poles from which the scalps hanged. In this case, Macario was dancing in front of his brother's scalp. The beating of captives upon their first arrival in camp and their participation in victory dances probably served as rites of passage, reinforcing the dependency on their captors and signaling their subservient status within the Comanche community. David Burnett, who lived several months among Comanches around 1818, wrote that if a captive survived the severe initiation of the first days in camp, he was afterwards exempt from corporal punishment, considered a member subconditionis of their society, and attached as a slave to the family of the warrior who captured him, where he was generally treated with humanity. During early captivity, most interactions between Comanches and captives took place in an atmosphere of pervasive fear. And I think this is important to understand the extreme harsh treatment that captives received. So an awareness of the overlying apprehensions of captives and captors is necessary to properly contextualize the often extreme violence and hardships that characterized early captivity. Captives feared their captors for obvious reasons. Odd-looking strangers who spoke an unintelligible language and acted in unpredictable, violent ways had seized them forcibly, often killing their relatives or friends in front of them at the time of capture or shortly thereafter. As Macario's story illustrates, grief was soon compounded with pain, as Comanches typically subjected their prisoners to harsh corporal and emotional trials. To captives, such abuse seemed wanton and vicious. The mistreatment, however, served to confuse the captives, make them dependent on their captors, and instill in them enough fear to prevent them from attempting to escape. It also served to assess the captives' capacity to adapt to the exacting life that awaited them, test the captives' hardiness and personal character, as well as their ability to obey orders and behave according to Comanche expectations, all of which signaled their potential for incorporation into the Comanche community. So in other words, this severe treatment had the purpose of finding out to what extent these children or these captives could adapt to the type of life that awaited them in captivity. Indeed, captives' survival depended largely on their physical and psychological fortitude, as well as on their proneness and ability to adapt to the Comanche way of life. So captives dreaded Comanches, but the captors, Comanches themselves, also had anxieties of their own. Comanche parties crossing enemy land, including those carrying captives, typically try to avoid being discovered by moving swiftly and stealthily to remain unexposed. They often traveled fast along the most impassable routes, sometimes without stopping to properly eat, drink, or sleep for days. Thus, recently taken captives, and often the raiders themselves, suffered hunger, thirst, sleep deprivation, inclement weather, physical pain, and psychological stress to diverse degrees during the capturing party's return trip. So this was rather common, but it's important to remember that many of these hardships were shared by the captives and the Comanches who have captured them. Going back to Macario, there is no suggestion in Macario's account that Comanches ever adopted him, as it was common in the case of younger captives. Because of his gender and age, when he was taken, Macario was probably enslaved, at least initially. Comanches used the term "cuhupa," meaning captured, to convey the idea of captive, and the word "turoaiwap," meaning worker, to convey the idea of slave. The status of enslaved captives often improved through time, however, and some were eventually fully incorporated. And this involved, or this affected even captives who had initially been enslaved. Repeated punishments for failing to communicate in Comanche and restrictions on captives' freedom of movement made learning the Comanche language and customs a matter of survival. While young children could become proficient in Comanche relatively fast and rarely attempted to escape, older captives only got to speak broken Comanche and tried to run away much more often. Occasionally, however, even people seized in their teens became proficient in Comanche. Apparently, Macario learned Comanche in just 1 year, amidst repeated punishments for failing to control the large horse herd assigned to him. Comanches systematically compelled male captives to take care of their livestock, which was Macario's main and seemingly only occupation in captivity. However, success on the warpath offered non-adopted male captives an avenue to incorporation. Comanches used to take their teenage male captives along on the warpath only after they were able to communicate fluently in Comanche. As another captive, Clinton Smith, recalled, quote, all the boys over 12 years old were compelled to go with them in their stealing raids, end quote. Once Macario became proficient in Comanche, a leader called Bajo el Sol, or Under the Sun, presumably his master, took him on his first campaign. During an encounter with American soldiers on the Colorado River in 1848, Bajo el Sol threatened to kill Macario unless he brought him one of the soldiers by the hair. Macario received several bullet shots in the shield and one in the leg before he returned with the Comanches empty-handed. The warriors scorned him, and he acknowledged to be afraid of the Americans. Bajo el Sol, the leader, then, and I quote, told him many curses and bad arguments, adding, now you will see what it is to be a man, and a man of the chosen ones. Then the Comanche leader entered the fight with his lance, dismounted, and despite receiving 20-something bullet shots, returned grabbing an American soldier by the hair, whom he presented Macario to fight. But the American was so tall, so much taller than Macario, that the captive could hardly move him. They started wrangling and fighting, and after the soldier hit Macario with his spur, Bajo el Sol himself had to knock him down and kill him. The fact that Bajo el Sol took Macario along in his first military expedition as a sort of squire suggests that he was Macario's captor, and he had somehow become Macario's master by then. This kind of client-patron relationship between a subordinate individual, usually a captive, and a successful warrior was common in 19th century Comanche society. The insistence with which Bajo el Sol compelled the captive to prove his courage during his first military engagement denotes the leader's strong interest in making of Macario a full-fledged warrior. Comanche leaders could increase their political clout by incorporating captives into their following as warriors. This was particularly urgent in the aftermath of the deadly smallpox and cholera epidemics that decimated Comanche bands in 1848 and 49, severely reducing their military might. At the same time, prowess on the warpath could significantly raise the status of a captive. Comanches were a highly martial rank society. Military deeds, the conspicuous display of plunder, and generosity in its redistribution were important avenues for men to gain prestige. Like Comanches by birth, male captives could acquire wealth and social esteem on the warpath. Indeed, horses and other loot acquired in raids permitted a captive to afford a Comanche bride, and marriage brought about full acceptance by the group. So being a successful warrior in the long term paid off if they managed to marry a Comanche woman. During his 7-year-long captivity, Macario was shot 7 times. Some Comanches took him on his final raid into Mexico, where they ran across some muleteers, killing all of them except one, whom they spared so that Macario himself could kill him. When the captive declined to execute the unfortunate Mexican, the warriors trashed him. At that point, Macario decided to escape, which he did that night, and I quote from his testimony, by distancing himself a little from the Indians under the pretext that he needed to relieve himself. We know little about Macario's life after captivity. He married Eustaquia de la Garza Huitron on February 7, 1859 in Laredo. Most returned Comanche captives ended up making a living as livestock herders or farmers, but we know that in this case, Macario was a shoemaker. And they often participated in campaigns against Comanches and other independent Indians as scouts, soldiers, and interpreters. So up to this point, I've been telling you the story of Macario, which I think is particularly interesting because of the nature of the testimony. It's not a literary narrative written to be sold, but rather an institutional testimony, right? Which makes it more likely to not be making up stuff. But I want to emphasize that much of what people think they know about Comanches is based on, at the very least, dubious evidence. So real and apocryphal captivity stories and incidents like the Fort Parker raid contributed early on to create an image of the Comanche as the archetypical wild Indian, an image that still figures prominently in Texan lore and American popular culture. Films, TV series, novels, and even scholarly studies have propagated around the world a slanted and simplistic view of Comanches and other Indians as bloodthirsty savages. Comanche characters are typically dehumanized, portrayed simply as merciless perpetrators of despicable acts of violence without providing any rationale whatsoever for their actions. Thus, Comanches come off as inherently murderous and cruel, an image that continues to be disseminated through film and literature. Nowhere is this more evident than in Texas, where I have been teaching American Indian history for a decade and a half. This unfortunate and prejudiced view is mistaken on at least three accounts. First, it assumes that Comanches are something of the past, a vanished people, an ethnographic curiosity at best. In fact, the Comanche Nation of Oklahoma, which used to be called Indian Territory, is a federally recognized tribe that currently counts about 17,000 enrolled members. Second, it implicitly denies the existence of a multiplicity of Comanche historical characters, men, women, and children, with diverse personalities, idiosyncrasies, and agendas. And third, it ignores that Comanches were often harmless to Euro-Americans, with whom they interacted peacefully many times, as in the case of the famous Moisebach-Comanche Treaty of 1847 that you can see on the slide. As a matter of fact, much of the violence attributed to Comanches was actually instigated by non-Comanches, sometimes a byproduct of aggression against Comanches by their purported victims. And this is the end of my presentation, and I would welcome questions or comments from the audience now.
Thank you so much. Oh, go ahead. Thank you, Joaquin. So we have plenty of time for Q&A. If there are anybody with a question, you may go ahead and ask Dr. Rivaya Martinez. Well, I'll just start then. Joaquin, I remember at a TSHA conference years ago, Gary Anderson make the reference to in terms of the question came up in terms of the identity of the Comanche nation or the Comanche people, that perhaps up to 1/4 of Comanches are probably Hispanic. Is that kind of fits with what you look at in your work?
It does actually. I think that falls short of the reality, you know. So around the turn of the 20th century, when the reservation land was allotted to individual Comanches, the most thorough Comanche census to that point was conducted. And according to the information compiled at the time, about 40% or so of Comanches were already of mixed descent. And most of those Comanches of mixed descent were descendants of Mexican captives. So, and Comanches have continued to mix since then, right? So chances are that, you know, the degree of, you know, intermarriage with members of other ethnic backgrounds has continued to increase.
Yeah, because that seems to fit with that slide that shows much of the Comanche raiding activity south of the present U.S.-Mexico border.
Right. Yeah. I mean, People are more familiar here in Texas with the raids occurred in Texas, right? But the reality is that between the 1810s and the 1850s, Comanches launched, you know, several hundred raids into Mexico, as a matter of fact. And you know, it's funny because here in Texas, we tend to talk about the so-called Great Comanche Raid of 1840, in which the Comanches reached the Gulf Coast. But in terms of the size of the Comanche party, right? We're talking about several hundred warriors. But that type of raid was rather common in Mexico for much of the 19th century. It was not unique at all.
Okay, thank you. We got a question over there. Go ahead. Uh, well, I say Hispanic largely also because of the fact that there were Western Comanches and Hispanos in New Mexico that would have been subject to captivity as well, but not in terms of the possibility of there being Coahuil Tejano.
I couldn't hear the question. I can only hear you.
He was asking if when in saying Hispanic, did that include Coahuiltecans in possibly in that mix, which
Well,
would
that's
have
a
been
good
an
question.
earlier period.
Yeah,
forward.
that's a good question. I mean, by the 19th century, Coahuiltecans were highly Hispanicized. So in that sense, you can argue that they were Hispanic, even though they were also native, right?
Mhm.
So yes, it probably included Coahuilteca, but I haven't been able to find any evidence of that identify some of these Mexican captives specifically as Coahuilteca.
Okay. And were you gonna ask? So they weren't homogenous. It was.
I couldn't hear the
She's
question.
wondering about the makeup of the Comanche not being homogenous. That you had a number of subgroups, and I know there's reference to them in terms of Western Comanche and Eastern Comanche, but it sounds like there were a lot of subgroups of Comanches.
Yeah,
That,
can you see the screen still?
yeah.
Okay,
Well,
so
now
if
it's
you,
really small because you're very large now. Your image
but that's
of
not up to
yourself.
me. That's up to you guys over there. I cannot change that.
Okay. Yeah. There we go.
Okay, so so Comanches. I mean, people in general tend to talk about Comanches, and Comanches were homogeneous culturally and linguistically. As a matter of fact, for instance, in the late 18th century, one Spanish source says that the only difference between them was the hairstyle. Um, but the reality is that Comanches never considered themselves a single, let's say, political unit.
Okay.
They behaved whenever they interacted with one another or with outsiders, they handled their own affairs independently from other groups. So only the largest Comanche groups received a name, and those are typically called divisions by the anthropologists. And the most important divisions in the 19th century were the ones I have included here. Yamparica, which means literally Yampa eater, Yampa being a root, an edible root. Those were the northernmost Comanches. Kutsudeca means literally bison eater, or actually it means bull eater. It's usually translated as buffalo eater. And these people lived were the closest to New Mexico. They spread from present day eastern New Mexico to western Oklahoma. And then kind of southeast of those were two smaller groups, the Noconi, which means literally, or can be translated as the wanderers. Noconi evokes the idea of a round trip, but it's used with regards to these people in the sense that they were constantly on the move, right? So sometimes the name is given in English as the Wanderers. Tenahua means it's an allusion to the fact of people living downriver. And then finally, Penareca here means literally honey eaters. And these were the southernmost Comanches, the ones that were most active in Texas during times of the Texas Republic and up to the 1850s. And then the Quahara, Quahara meaning literally antelope, are probably just the same people as the Kotsoreca, but known by a different name. It's not 100% clear whether this is a splinter group or they are actually the same people. And the Quahara do not enter the documentary record until the 1850s or so. So those are the main Comanche divisions. And for instance, whenever the Texas or the Spanish or Mexico or the United States made agreements with the Comanches, they made agreements with particular divisions. They never made agreements with the whole Comanche nation. As a matter of fact, all the Comanches did not come together as a group until they were all forced to stay on the reservation.
Okay. Other questions, comments? And Joaquin, would the Comanches then, in turn, I mean, because you talk about conflict with the Americans, and you show the contrast in terms of peace made with the, for example, the German settlers in Fredericksburg. But what about inter-tribal conflict? Were there? We know that the Comanches had always been applying pressure on the Liban Apache, for example, that affected relations here in San Antonio. But did they ever end up taking goods off the Apaches or captives from them?
Yeah. From the beginning, when Comanches entered the documentary record in 1706, they're already taking Apache captives. And the situation will remain like that until the early 19th century. There is a tendency to assume that Comanches and Apaches were always at odds and constantly fighting. And that's true to some extent, but it's not, that was not, let's say, a permanent status. As a matter of fact, in the early 19th century, in the context of the Mexican Wars for independence, the Southern Comanche and the Lipan Apache form an alliance that permits the Comanches to start raiding northeastern Mexico for the first time. There have been a few earlier Comanche raids into northeastern Mexico, but at this point, the Comanches begin to penetrate much more deeply into Mexico and much more frequently and in larger numbers. And that's a pattern that will persist into the 1850s. So it was partly thanks to this alliance with the Lipan Apache that the Comanche became acquainted with northeastern Mexico. You can argue that the Lipan Apache were instrumental in that sense in the expansion of Comanche raiding southward.
Yeah, that's interesting. Go ahead, follow up. Yeah. Did you hear that, Joaquin?
Nope,
okay.
Not a word.
Yeah. So was it primarily the Penateca Comanches that would have been involved in a lot of the northern Mexican raids? For example, Macario Leal himself, outside on the outskirts of Laredo, that were doing those raids.
Yes, we know that the Penatecas were very active raiding south of, along the Rio Grande and also in other parts of Texas and northeastern Mexico in the first half or so of the 19th century. They were probably the primary raiders depending on what parts of Mexico. But around the year 1840, you start to see massive invasions of Comanches to farther west and southwest. as far south, according to some authors, to Querétaro, which is not that far away from Mexico City, as a matter of fact. Um, and chances are that Comanches from different divisions raided together most of the time. Not only that, but Comanches also involved other Native Americans in the raids. For instance, early in the 19th century, somewhere around the turn of the 19th century, Comanches make an alliance with the Kiowas. And we know that there were some Kiowas raidings down in Mexico with the Comanches for a good part of the 19th century. We know also that some of the earliest Comanche campaigns in northeastern Mexico involved Wichita-speaking peoples, like the Tawayas that you mentioned, or the Tawaconis. And then in some, for a short period of time between the 1810s and the 1820s, Comanches and Liban Apaches were also raiding together. Now, identifying what particular group of Comanches was raiding in Mexico is really difficult, because much of the time, the evidence only tells you that they were either Indians or Barbaros, as you pointed out, Indios Barbaros, meaning wild Indians. Or sometimes they would point out whether they were Comanches or Kiowas or Apaches, right? But they don't get into more detail than that most of the time. Sometimes, however, when you can use captives' testimonies, they are more specific. So you can make inferences. They tell you, well, they took me to the Colorado River. Well, then we know that they were Penatecas. But if they take them to the Arkansas River, then we know they were Yamparicas. And sometimes they are specific. We know that some of the Plains Indians raiding in deep into Mexico in the mid-19th century involved not just Comanches and Kiowas, but also occasionally Cheyennes and even Shoshones, who live much farther north in present-day Wyoming. So, but those were not as commonly found south of the border.
Yeah, no, we're doing good on time. Go ahead. What about Mexican independence from Spain? Did the indigenous peoples help in either way in that struggle, Joaquin?
Yeah, they actually did. I think that tomorrow I think there will be an interesting talk on the subject as part of this event. But that was an important turning point in Comanche history. So on the one hand, you have the Mexican insurgent movement against the Spanish crown that starts roughly in 1810 and reaches Texas rather fast. From the very beginning, Comanche loyalties were divided, and some Comanches, as a matter of fact, sided with the royalists, but many others sided with the insurgents. Which is also an important hint that Comanches were not unified politically, right? That different bands made their own decisions in terms of alliances and trade partners and so forth. One of the most immediate consequences of the Mexican independence movement is that following the Battle of Medina and the tremendous impact that it had in central Texas, several Mexican insurgents took refuge in East Texas, in the area that you know well, Francis, not just in Nacogdoches, but also farther east in Louisiana, right? And among those were two, Tarin and Ruiz, who became very involved with the Comanches. So there had been this informal or illicit trade, as you pointed out, between independent Indians and the people living in East Texas and in southern Louisiana for some time. But on the one hand, you have the Mexican independence movement that creates havoc for the Spanish, right? They have to deviate resources to other parts. They are under supplied. The presidio system suffers the consequences of all of this. And then at the same time, you have a tremendous development of the cotton industry in the South that creates this huge demand for horses and mules. So it was the perfect setting for Comanches to start raiding massively as they did. So getting back to the original question, yes, Comanches and other natives in Texas got involved, but it was not a clear cut. Let's say they didn't take sides the way we tend to think of it, right? They were more opportunistic in their decisions than they were not guided by principle. Let's put it that way.
Okay, question. Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, how far was did the assimilation go of these captives? Were they really seen part of the indigenous nation or not?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So different authors have different interpretations on this.
Mm-hmm.
But I can tell you that based on my own research, excuse me, based on my own research, I mean, I've been doing research on this for over 15 years, and I have compiled a database of roughly 1,400 captives, most of which, or most of whom we don't really know much. But out of those that we really know something, um, I have concluded that roughly 15% or so of the captives that Comanches took ended up becoming incorporated, which means that they became full-fledged Comanches. Now, the process of incorporation was very different depending on the peculiarities of the captive, right? So, for instance, in the rare instances that Comanches captured infant children, they adopted them right away, and they raised them like Comanches
Hold
by
on,
birth.
Joaquin. They're doing an announcement.
Oh, okay.
Okay, you can continue, Joaquin. They were doing an announcement on the intercom.
Okay, I'm not buying anyway. So children, so the smallest children were adopted right away, and then older children were generally they became servants or slaves. But the treatment of these slaves improved if they became acquainted with Comanche language and the Comanche way of life. So the more acculturated they became, the stronger their chances of being eventually incorporated. For for men, for male Comanches, it seems that success on the warpath was an important turning point. For women, on the other hand, even though many became wives, what mattered most for them in terms of changing their status was becoming mothers. So it wasn't until female captives became mothers that they were treated on an equal basis with other in this case Comanche women. Now we also have evidence that the fact that these people were not Comanches by birth was not easily forgotten by everyone, right? So there are instances in which fully acculturated and incorporated captives are still being called captive as an insult, for instance, right? So, but yes, so again, to put it in a nutshell, captives could be fully incorporated, but the process could be long, and it changed considerably from captive to captive. That was not a systematic way of doing it.
Joaquin, in the few minutes that we have left, I showed 446. Go to 450. The time period of Macario Leal's captivity in the late 1840s, early 1850s. Did you come across in your documentation fugitive slaves trying to escape to freedom in Mexico, being picked up by Comanches or even Apaches, or some
I
sort of
didn't.
interaction?
You're talking about African slaves, right?
Yes.
American slaves. Yeah, I didn't come across any specific instances of African Americans running away to the Comanche, except in the area of present-day Indian Territory. There is one very interesting case in which this African man is eventually recovered by some American troops, and they asked him, so how was it, living with the Comanches? And he said, well, I was doing well until you guys came after me. Compared with my early life, I was, every day seemed to be a holiday.
Wow. All right. Well, we're good then. Let's go ahead and thank Dr. Rivaya Martinez. Thank you, Joaquin.
Thank you.